Good evening. I'm Alex Moulton, and this evening I'll be starting in the fictitious lands of Wakanda as a way of grounding some of the themes that are central to my research. Themes around the making of black kinship and the politics of community that have characterized the Black Atlantic since the emergence of the plantation slave trade. And so my research sociologically attempts to think through how these fictitious communities have been reproduced in time and some of those politics. And to ground this research, I focus on Jamaican Maroon communities, which, not unlike Wakanda, have been carved out of very harsh geographical conditions. And so here we see the cockpit country that's sort of an inverted eggshell kind of terrain. And this is a terrain that, beginning in the 1650s, black communities started to form in resistance to the plantation system. As these plantation communities emerge as a sort of counter-cultural, counter-hegemonic communities, you can see that they specialize their own agroecological formations, different kinds of quasi-urban settings, which are very much the kind of stuff that we see in the depictions of Wakanda. Similarly to the kinds of politics that we see in Wakanda, these communities formed an identity around resistance to oppressors. And this is depicted here, a siege that was conducted by the Maroon communities in resistance to the British demands that they submit. I'm arguing in my research that we should focus on these communities to find out how the construction of black identity are tied to negotiations of power. One such important negotiation of power has to do with the formation of post-treaty Maroon communities. And this began in 1739 when the Maroon signed treaties with the British. Here we see old Cudjoe depicted as almost an animalistic guy. These communities went on post-treaty to be distributed across the British Empire to help British state-making. Here we see a church in Sierra Leone where they were used to quash native resistance to British colonialism, and a fort in Canada that the Maroons were used to help construct in the furtherance of British colonial projects. I'm arguing that these things are really important to think about in understanding the politics of black identity because they point us to some of the things that happen in the immediate pre-emancipation or immediate post-abolition period in Jamaica, where the Maroons were used to quash native rebellions as part of this treaty that they made with the British. And one of those individuals that was killed as part of these efforts was Japman Song. This uneasy tension between the Maroons and the government came to a head when bauxite was discovered, and bauxite became the sort of central stuff of techno-modernity in the same way that vibranium became the central thing that drove Captain America's state-making projects on behalf of America. It's also important to note that the discovery of bauxite cannot be separated from Reynolds Aluminum, which is a subsidiary of Reynolds Tobacco. And so this contestation around bauxite and around the kinds of regimes of extraction I'm arguing are really important for sort of understanding the constellations and continuities in power. And here I have an image that shows the various boundaries of Maroon communities that are being negotiated. And so in this period after British treaty making and contestations around bauxite, the Maroon treaties emerge. This document emerges as a sort of central stuff around identity is constructed and becomes a kind of symbolic device. Importantly, as this is happening, we see that the Maroons begin to frame an identity that connects to the struggles here in America. And this is today sort of being articulated with a kind of neo-indigenous, Afro-indigenous articulation that attempts to negotiate the constellations of power in Jamaica in very interesting ways. So we have the Prime Minister Center, 2 Maroon colonels, and a local politician. These politics I'm arguing, the politics of identity, the politics of the production of the state, are really central to understanding both contemporary conservation in Jamaica, depicted by the 2 images of Jamaica's National Park World Heritage Site, happening in rural Jamaica, but also the kinds of mega infrastructure projects that are tied to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. And here we have, speaking on some of these issues, the Canadian High Commissioner here and the British High Commissioner there, who, in a very interesting turn of events, are now supporting Afro-Indigenous rights in Jamaica. And so I'm interested in the kinds of political incentives that motivate those kinds of negotiations. And I've begun to think about these things in a very geographical way, thinking about the ways in which the production of boundaries, for example, can both hinder and aid indigenous resistance. This is the Prime Minister presenting in Parliament a map that would ostensibly protect a protected area or an area to be protected from mining. What we see is that the clever negotiations that the government is involved with, continuing with these sort of techno-modern developmentist agendas, leads to some very curious kinds of things with the map, almost like gerrymandering. And so we see that there are different boundaries proposed. The smaller boundaries are the boundary that the government proposes. The other boundaries are what the community wants. Out of this has come a very broad-based social movement, grounded grassroots environmental movement that is mobilizing Jamaicans from all races, creeds, and religious and social identities. So we see Rastafarians joining with indigenous Native American communities and children. And all of these things might seem to be sort of obvious, but Jamaica has a very tenuous relationship to these communities and to the kinds of identity politics. And so, for example, the only woman in Jamaican currency is a maroon woman. And the only national heroine is a maroon woman. Yet this is obfuscated in national discourses and very stalled policies with gender rights and so on. And so I'm interested in the ways in which these communities, because they provide a space for these social and geographical tensions, might allow us to think through the kinds of abolitionist politics that might come about from the union of indigenous communities and Afro-indigenous communities here conducting a ceremony. And I've begun to use my work in these communities to also interrogate the ways in which similar kinds of spaces are constructed in Jamaica, spaces of enclosure and capture that are increasingly typifying almost a permanent state of emergency and the increased militarization of the Jamaican police. And this is me taking my students on fieldwork critiquing and interrogating police officers. This work would have no meaning, I think, if it did not create these openings for, as I said, a kind of abolitionist ecology and a kind of politics that moves away from narrow identitarian kinds of social movements. And so this is the kinder tree, the family tree in the main Maroon community on the 6th of January when all folks gather to think about these things. Thank you.